Good. Well, thank you very much, Mark, for inviting me, and thank you all who are joining us in this virtual talk. I'm talking today about Hyde Abbey and the research by Hyde900 aimed at trying to bring the Abbey back to life. Whereabouts is Hyde? Well, it's on the outskirts of Winchester, and for those who don't know, it's here just outside of North Walls. Let me just mention about where I live. We live in Headbourne Worthy, and I'll explain briefly how I got involved in this project. We bought our cottage in 1969, and this is how it looked when we bought it. It had been renovated from 1952, and interestingly, the records show that in the 19th century it was regarded as derelict, and therefore quite a lot of renovation had been done. And from what we saw, most of it seemed to entail actually covering up all the period features. So we spent the next 40 years uncovering them. We started above this fireplace. It was covered up with plasterboard, and when we removed it, it revealed some quite interesting stonework. It's the first time we'd seen stonework in the house, and in particular there was quite an interesting shaped stone. Let's just look at that a bit closely. So we thought, this is interesting. It's not just normal ashlar, but it's some reused stone from somewhere or other. And we then took away some concrete from the other side of the fireplace, and this was revealed, and what appeared to be, in fact, the back of another fireplace. Going up to the first floor landing, again covered with plasterboard, it revealed this. Fascinating amount of ashlar, and also some more interesting shaped moulded stone. I think it's probably fair to say by this time my wife Trish wasn't too happy about the way things were going. There was comments like, this isn't a museum, is it? So I had to do a bit of work just to try and turn it into something that looked a bit better. So a bit of lime mortar pointing seemed to do the job. There was also a rockery in the garden, and we weren't great gardeners, and that seemed a bit like hard work. And there was a lot of stone that looked like this when we moved in. So it seemed to be quite interesting stone and sort of suitable for building. So we decided to build a bridge. And this is what we built. It was over it's actually the running through the garden is a traditional Hampshire bourne, which you're probably familiar with. It basically runs normally from mid-winter to midsummer. Though it's interesting with the current rains, it started running already. So the water reservoirs seem to be pretty full around Hampshire. And we realized later that this actually came from the demolished half of the chimney. You probably remember the picture of the back of the chimney. Well, obviously the part of the inglenook had been cut away, presumably to make more room in that area. A particularly nice piece of stone we felt was too nice to actually put into the bridge was this piece. And we put it into the new extension we were building, and luckily the house wasn't listed, which was something of a miracle, we felt. And we always wondered where this stone came from. Sort of when I had a bit of time, I thought, well, I'll Google it, and I Googled, as one does, sort of stones from Hyde Abbey, and much to my amazement, I came across a organisation that was actually dedicated to looking at Hyde Abbey, and it was called Hyde900. And this stones project, which they had, was just one of the many interests of this very active community group. The group was set up to commemorate the 900th anniversary of the move to Hyde of Newminster to its new place on the outskirts of Winchester. Part of the reason was that the New Minster was very close to the Old Minster, And as the Bishop of Winchester owned most of the buildings in Winchester, and he didn't really like Newminster being alongside him, he diverted the sewers through Newminster, with the result that they used some of the land that they'd been bequeathed in 963 by the king, and they rebuilt their abbey in Hyde. There's a whole series of things that Hyde900 gets involved in, not just researching Hyde Abbey, which is my area, but in fact in lectures, in wassails, music, and the annual King Alfred weekend, designed to celebrate the death of King Alfred, as it was then 900 years previously. And so if we go on to the stones, if it was found that our chimney was made from Hyde stone, would this group Hyde900 want them? In which case that might be a bit unpopular with my wife. Well, or did they belong to someone else? Perhaps this man. I suspect most of you will recognize him, Henry VIII, because of course he was the one who dissolved the abbey, and maybe his descendants, maybe the Queen wanted them back. Or perhaps this person, who you may recognize as Thomas Cromwell. And the reason for the stones was, of course, that Hyde Abbey was a major part of medieval life, not just of Winchester, but of Wessex as a whole. At the time it was built at the beginning of the 12th century, Winchester was one of the most important cities in England. And because of its importance as the final burial place of Alfred the Great, and the fact it had some very serious relics, Thomas Cromwell and particularly his henchmen were responsible for demolishing it. And all that is left in Hyde, as for those of you who know the area, is of course the gatehouse. This actually dates to the 15th century. And it was interesting that in 1539, Thomas Wriothesley himself was in Winchester in person to see that the church was destroyed. There's a lovely letter that is in the records of him writing to Cromwell saying that we've destroyed the relics of in the cathedral. We're now moving to demolish Hyde Abbey. So it was quite an undertaking. I think it will show you later. Anyway, it was very important, and so this was, I say, the only thing left. And not just was it demolished and it was taken out of the area, but also most of the records seem to have been destroyed as well. And so this is very little time, very little research to go on. So it's a really hard job trying to reconstruct it, because what we're trying to do is take it out from the shadows and bring the Abbey into focus. If we talk about the size of the church, which you're seeing portrayed here, to give you some idea, this is the relative size compared with Romsey Abbey and Winchester Cathedral. You know, it was an enormous church. It was 80% of the size, as you can see there. And if we look at it against today's streets, it occupied 11 hectares just outside the very important area of the North Gate. The amount of stonework that is around testifies to the quantity that was used, and I've estimated that in fact we're probably talking about 50,000 tons of stone were in the church alone, the church buildings. And so clearly a lot of stone around, it's been reused. And for those of you familiar with the gatehouse area, you may recognize this wall. And so if we look briefly at the history of the Abbey, after the dissolution, it was shown, of course, that in fact it was Thomas Wriothesley who had a lease of the Abbey, and he was actually demolishing it. And the lease records in the Court of Augmentations the papers which said that in fact everything was to augment Henry VIII's coffers. And not for nothing was it called the Court of Augmentations. And if we go on to look at what the stone happened to the stone, there is stone recorded as going to Thomas Risley's residence, Tedgefield Abbey, and so some of it went there. There's other information in the wonderful facility you're probably familiar with, like the Hampshire Record Office, and we came across this record of a transfer of lead from Hyde Abbey of 230 foders. And putting it in today's term, that's no less than 220 tons. And it's recorded as going to Henry VIII's castles of Hurst, Southsea, Sandown. To put that into context, you may remember that in fact the Winchester Cathedral received a grant because the presbytery roof of the cathedral was leaking, and this was a massive effort, and it was a £4 million project, and the total amount of lead that was actually reused in that roof was 27 tons. So I think it puts the 220 tons from the Abbey into focus. In 1546, the site passed to Richard Bethel, who was at one time an MP for Winchester, and in the Chancery Rolls of Henry VIII, the transaction is recorded. It lists certain conditions covering various items that were reserved for the king, and I thought it was worth reproducing this in full because the wording is just lovely. Glorious English, I think you'd agree with. So it appeared that a lot of the buildings still existed 7 years after dissolution, but apart from the manors which Bethel inherited under the grant, all he got in terms of the Abbey was the site itself. Everything else was for the use of the King, His Highness. That didn't stop Bethel building a fine house from the ruins of the Abbey, and I'm not sure that I'd have taken the risk, but he did, and he built it, and we're lucky enough to have actually the plans in the Record Office of his magnificent house and estate. You can see the picture of the house at the top of the screen. Now, unfortunately, Richard didn't last long, and his son William soon took over and unfortunately got into debt, probably trying to complete this estate, which is a very grand estate indeed. And he ended up borrowing £2,000 from his friend John Ward, who was a London leather seller, and he gave the site as security. Having got his £2,000, Bethel promptly transferred the property to his son. Needless to say, Ward took a pretty dim view about losing his security because £2,000 was several million in today's money. And this led to an endless dispute between them. Court records show this rumbled on for some 20 years and 7 judicial proceedings. This is one from the glorious records of the Court of Star Chamber. By the way, if anybody is good at medieval legal English, would they like to contact me? Because there are a lot of documents like this which would show light on Hyde Abbey. So please do email me via the address that I'll give you at the end. Anyway, it was finally resolved to Ward's benefit in courts in 1582, which actually gave him swingeing damages. However, Ward couldn't resist actually removing 3 cartloads of stone from the abbey. Where did the stone go to? Well, it's recorded in a book in the turn of the century. It went to Worthy Paunceford, now part of Headbourne Worthy. So that's interesting. Maybe that's where our stone arose from. Moving on to finding the actual stones so we can visualize what the abbey looks like. As I said, there's a lot around, and this is some of the stonework in Bethel's house, part of which, the servants' quarters of which, is still remaining. Many other stones in the Hyde Abbey area, if you spotted them around. This is some particularly nice voussoirs, and another one indeed. And then another lead we had was just up the road in Headbourne Worthy. Again, some more stonework and a piece of stone that you may recognise, very similar to what was above our fireplace, what is above our fireplace. Another lead, this time Pesner, takes us to Micheldever Tower. I don't know whether any of you have been inside the tower. There's a pretty tortuous spiral staircase, which one ignores health and safety regulations to go up. It was built by Thomas Risley, apparently, and on the north-facing tower side, it is a lot of stonework, some of it quite interesting. This actually isn't decoration, as some of you may realize. It's actually the grooves made for taking a mortar or lead joint between adjacent stones. Going up into the staircase, there was some more of this type of stonework, this time a vaulting rib, and other similar stonework. This is some shaft pieces reused in the spiral staircase, and then a trefoil window reused as a stair tread. Reaching the bell chamber, once again, one of these stones which we nicknamed whistle stones, but are more probably spoken about as nook shaft stones. At this stage, we thought, well, we had another major find, and we were beginning to look at these various ones. There's also some that people found in their gardens. This is another voussoir, similar to the one that was found in the wall. And so we uploaded them to a Google map, because people like to see, oh, that's my stone there, and we've got this on our website. And the aim of this was really to try and visualize what the abbey looked like, because these stones all tell a story. And with the help of Ross Lovett, who some of you may know, till recently head mason at Winchester Cathedral, here he is demonstrating stone carving at one of the King Alfred weekends. He used his other skills of taking this and turning it into that. A very special ability he's got to actually not just interpret stones, but also do these wonderful drawings. And certainly he needed all his skill when he took this and turned it into that. And this, amazingly, is part of that, which was probably one of the entrances to the church, or perhaps one of the more important buildings on the church estate. All this research enabled the University of Winchester to create a reconstruction of the abbey, and this is what it might have looked like. For those of you who are familiar with Winchester Leisure Centre, it would have towered over the horizon there. And so that would have been an amazing sight from the area around Hyde and all the north of Winchester. We're not just interested in stone, but other building materials, and we found some timber. This is in the tower of St. Bartholomew's Church, another tower built from the stone from the abbey. And also there was some timber in the house that Bethel built, the servants' quarters I mentioned in Hyde Street. This had been seen by John Crook, and some of the material there is of significant interest. That was probably an ecclesiastical screen, and it appears to have been reused material. And for instance, we found this lovely moulding, which was actually a tie beam that was upside down. But if we go back to the roof timbers themselves, you'll see this is possibly part of a roof. And in John Crook's view, it was a seven-canted roof, which is usually associated with high-status ecclesiastical buildings. And the clues here are in the mortises. And this encouraged us to do some dendrodating of the timber. Not an easy job, as Andrew Moir, our tree ring expert, is here trying to get a date from the tire timber. He looks particularly uncomfortable, doesn't he? What doesn't show is the hundreds of pigeons that were around at the time. So Bethel's construction date of the original roof of Bethel's building after dendrodating turned out to be an amazing 1266 to 1298. So what we had found was in fact part of the roof of a major building from the original build of the Abbey, or the build of an Abbey house or lodging or guest house, possibly subsequent to the build in 1110. And so some pretty exciting finds, and we went on to then look at what it might have looked like. We measured it, and with the help of other beams, we were able to look and say, this is what the shape of the roof was. And just to prove that our dendrochronologist wasn't the only one to be uncomfortable, we had to pose for this appalling photo by the Hampshire Chronicle news reporter, where it appears that one of the people there, who's on the left, who seems to be crucified on this beam, is actually an Adam architecture architect who is posing there. Further research into this roof also produced some examples in Winchester. Those of you who are familiar with St. John's Church in the Soak, this is a similar seven-canted roof. And the other one we've identified is in fact of roughly the same date, the guest house to Romsey Abbey, known as King John's House. Some of you may recognize that. So apart from stones and timber, we also found some encaustic tiles, and the store, museum store, houses lots more in addition to the ones we found. One of the nicest ones is this, where we found it with a crown. And we now produced a catalogue of over 100 different images of the patterns of the tiles, encaustic tiles of the 13th century, almost certainly. And what Dave did, he's also our mapping expert, he superimposed the outline of what was known about the Abbey site on a Google map, and that's now on our website. Another view of that map shows the interventions, and this shows all the excavations and service trenches that have been put into the site following the demolition of the Abbey, and it gives us an idea of what might be underneath people's gardens. Now, one of the couple who were particularly interested in this were actually the people who were in the south transept area of the Abbey, and they seemed quite happy that we were actually going to trash their gardens with a community dig. So an ideal place to look for evidence of the south transept, and it would also satisfy our remit of involving the community by running this community dig. And I know that you in your society have done several of these digs. This was the first one we did. It was in 2016. And so we went to set about this, and we aimed to encourage as wide a range of people as possible. And so we set up on a website offering 2-hour slots to people, and we recruited David Ashby from the University of Winchester, who has a lot of experience in community digs, as some of you may know, and the local archaeological society, WARG, to provide supervisors and equipment. And we had a tremendous response. We had 2 test pits marked out, and we had 40 people registered to take part in the dig. And it was pretty damp, as you can see, as the first set of volunteers were ready to line up and take part. And it turned into a pretty damp morning. We luckily got some gazebos, which covered most of the area, which was encouraging for them. And everybody seemed to be enjoying themselves. One of our volunteers seemed to be doing something like a rain dance as he was trying to sieve what appeared to be like plasticine in the way of spoil from one of the trenches. And he wasn't the only one getting wet. The dig was open to all, and here is 2 of the young volunteers waiting to take part. Luckily, the weather had cleared by lunchtime and some hard digging was going on, showing it's never too young to start archaeology. We're lucky enough to have Steve Brine, our MP, visit the site, and he is here looking at one of the test pits. And after that, he helped with the sieving. It was nice to hear his comment at the end of the sieving. He said it was the best hour of the week of his term in Parliament. One of the supervisors held a masterclass in finds, and by the end of the day, not only had we got 40 people experienced in archaeology, but for the first time we'd located the south transept wall. As important as the archaeology, everybody seemed to enjoy it, and without doubt, everybody from the feedback sheets wanted to take part in another dig. Tekka was our lead supervisor of this. Some of you may recognize him, and a consolation prize for the trashing of their garden. We presented a small token to the householders you'll see on the right here. We then went on to a further dig in 2017, and we were lucky enough to find not just 1, but 2 householders happy to take part, this time in the other side of the cloister. Fantastic location. As you can see, nothing has been done in the way of excavations in this area at all. And let's just have a look before we talk about the dig itself at what we might expect to find. Some of you may well be aware of this drawing, which is known as the Plan of St. Gall. It was an abbey that was actually never built, but it was produced in the 10th century and was drawn to formalize the appearance of Benedictine abbeys for the future under the Carolingian reforms. An interpretation of it looked like this. And so we were hoping that we would be about here in our excavations, i.e. over the site of the refectory. So what might we find? Perhaps the odd spoon, or in fact, perhaps the remains of the foundations of the cloister. And here's a nice artist's impression. And once again, this is where we would hope to be. We're confident of great dig. Well, the reason was one of our householders has actually found quite a lot of finds from the abbey that we had access to. This is a rather nice Purbeck marble shaft dating back to the 13th century. And this bit hewn from car stone. And so we really hoped of great things and more finds like this. And so following the successful platinum of last year, we had the previous year, we actually increased the number of days to 4 days, and we had 5 pits instead of 2. And we had a full complement of 20 volunteers sharing the first 2-hour stint. Needless to say, of course, this was before COVID-19. As some of you are aware, we can't have that kind of number nowadays in an area. Anyway, going back to 2017, this is our lead supervisor, again, Tekka Jones, preparing a briefing, and everybody was taking part with gay abandon, and a lot of successful archaeology was found. The first find from this in number 15, King Alfred Terrace, was this. Some of you may recognize it. I normally ask people, but of course, being a virtual event, I can't do that. What guess that would be? In fact, for those who don't recognize it, it's a Victorian pudding doll. There was no lower age limit, so on Saturday we had several pupils from the local primary school, St. Pede's, take part. And after a bit, this is with one of their parents. I can just see him saying, "Gosh, this is hard work. I'll let Mum get on with it while I supervise." We'd already organised an immersive half-day session for St. Bede's, and so they came to the dig really with some knowledge of what we were doing. And the part of that immersive half-day session was, in fact, doing things like making medieval tiles. And it was lovely to see the enthusiasm of the young for this. And once again, our mayor did us the honour of participating. And this is a bird's eye view of the garden that we were operating in. As you see, it's very much keyhole archaeology. And incidentally, of course, this meant that we had no ability to do any geophys. And so we were really going on historic records plus a certain amount of probing, plus, of course, what people had found in their gardens in the area we were looking at. Other people did the invaluable job of cleaning and recording the finds. And some, of course, were finding more tile fragments. He's very proud of this one. That's a very nice piece of encaustic tile. Steve again came to us, this time aided by his son. He had his own personalized sieve by this time. And others were coping with the media because there was quite a lot of TV presence in the thing. And at the end of day 4, what was our key find? It was a medieval wall. Next to the wall, over only 30 centimeters below garden level, we had this stonework. And as we were closing the dig, there was a bit more work to do, and John Crook had a look at what we'd found, and it revealed some quite interesting stonework that had been obviously reused, and it ended up with a piece of stone like this, and even more of them, a row of them like that. And the stonework proved to be a series of early 12th century voussoirs and abacus from the original Norman cloister. And this, together with many other finds, proved to be an arch. And this actually was put together. And before that, we actually looked at some of the charcoal, which is underneath these reused stones. And it proved to be that, in fact, the dating of the charcoal proved it to be reused around 1300 to 1350. And so what had happened was that in 1141, the abbey had been burnt down during the war between Stephen and Matilda. And the stonework was obviously in ruins up until that time, because all these voussoirs were laid in a neat row and they were in very good condition. And so once again, we ended up with a successful dig, and in fact, really had a great achievement in finding those voussoirs. So we went back to King Alfred Terrace for the 2018 dig, and we had now 3 gardens, and Chris Pryor, who had the garden with all the stonework in it, was quite happy we attacked the end of his garden. This was subject to moving his shed, and that was one that was in the adjacent garden, so friend Justine, she wanted it got rid of. It was in fairly parlous condition. But Chris Pryor ended up moving his shed. And we managed to achieve that without too much trauma. And we then set about digging up his freshly made concrete base. And we got all that out. And when we had actually ended up with 3 clear gardens once we got rid of yet another shed. And so this was number 10 at the start of the dig. And being a Hyde900 dig, it turned wet. But this didn't deter another contingent from the St. Bede School. And as previously, lots of media attention. You may recognize Mark Mardell there from The World at One. We did have some fairly serious expertise at hand. You probably might recognize, some of you, Martin Biddle on the left-hand side, and John Crook in the yellow taking some photographs. On the right is the proud householder, and he actually helped us enormously in actually uncovering the rest of his garden. Others were hard at work, finding digs, finding artifacts, and they, particularly enthusiastic young, were actually attacking this trench in number 10. And the areas yielded some amazing finds. This, a 13th century head carved from cornstone, and this, a delightful little thumb-sized fragment of some carving in Bath stone. And not only the period was medieval, but we actually came across a whole lot of opus signinum. This is the Roman plaster work, showing the volume being that there was previously a Roman building on this site. And then this rather nice piece, I don't know whether anybody recognizes it, but in fact, it's a stone called travertine, and it's the deposit at the bottom of the Roman aqueducts. It was fairly widely used in Germany, and we think this must have come over in Roman times. Meanwhile, back in number 14, Chris Pryor's garden, we came across this amazing continuation of the line of voussoirs. And so it was able to lift these because they were so close to the surface, and it provided no less than 22 of these wonderfully finely carved Romanesque voussoirs. We were able to explore further down in a sondage, and it revealed underneath these foundations, there was a clay layer some 400 to 800 millimeters thick, almost a meter thick clay. And that was providing the foundation for the abbey. And that dates back, we think, almost certainly to the first build in the early part of the 12th century. So the finding of this wall enabled us now to look at what the shape of the cloister was, and it surprisingly demonstrated that the cloister wasn't actually rectangular like most of them, but was actually slightly off rectangular. And this is what the Frater might have looked like. Well, we think we found the refectory. And we got enough now for Ross, our friend, to actually do a drawing of how the cloisters might look. And he produced this lovely image of it, as it might have been in the 13th century. The finding of all this stonework, because not only did the voussoirs actually provide a fit together, but also the abacus, and we had several of those abacus fit in at the bottom below the capitals, it showed that in fact they all came from the same cloister arch, and we were able to reconstruct this with a demonstration of it, a reconstruction, which is now in the Winchester Museum. So anyway, that was there and has roused a lot of interest and is a really nice testament to the community digs. Now, if we move on to this year, some of you are aware we managed to put on a further series of digs some 3 weeks ago. Just amazing timing, really. And we were lucky to have two of your members, I don't know whether they're watching today, Bryony Lalore and Ginny Pringle, who came along to act as supervisors, and we're really grateful for their expertise. And this time it was in 4 gardens, one in the garden adjacent to the one which produced the arch, and then we actually moved across into outside of the garden into, this is, oh yes, a lovely one of Bryony, a very wet Bryony. At least Bryony had the gazebo, which didn't blow away. Most of the other ones did because of the wind. And anyway, in Bryony's Trench, we found another abbey wall, and that confirmed our drawings of the cloister shape. And then going outside to the west, for the first time outside of the cloister area, we went here, and we'd actually been alerted to the possibility of some foundations of abbey buildings. And at that time when these were found, this partly robbed out foundation, there was a foot-thick pile of oyster shells beside it, an amazing quantity. And once we were involved in the dig itself, it showed that the building had been at least 2 stories high, because the width of the foundation was 1.5 meters wide. And this was to be a very productive trench, because what you see here is our consultant archaeologist, David Ashby. He's actually removing a cache of medieval glass, which was an absolute bonus in terms of the find. And it includes fragments like this. And this clearly was a very high status building, because obviously the glass came from the building, and we have a total of about 400 pieces. And David Ashby is currently cleaning and conserving this glass. And in fact, we're looking at trying to put these 400 pieces together. So crossword puzzle and crossword experts and those who are good at jigsaws would be welcome to help. We also dug 2 other gardens in the area of the nave of the church. This was the first time we moved across to the nave of the church, and it revealed a very rough tiled floor surface. And this isn't just of the church, but in fact is of the Bridewell, the prison that was built over the top of the church and is outlined in blue here. And the arrow showed where our 2 trenches were. And so that almost certainly was the floor of the Bridewell, which was built in 1788 over the area of the nave of the church. Ginny's Trench, a demolition layer of chalk clunge blocks, indicated there was archaeology below this, and it seemed likely there was about 1.65 meters down. And here's a picture of Ginny, who is actually explaining here to the mayor as to what was found. So anyway, just to round up, what we hope we are finding is sufficient information to show that the monks weren't doing this in their cloisters, which might lead to this, but hopefully getting on with this. And so anyway, if anybody would like to be involved in any future digs, please do contact us via this website. But thank you very much indeed for listening to me.